Hi there, my name is Ray Hitchins, and I'm here today to talk to you about reggae guitar playing. Before we start with the exercise and techniques, I'd like to talk a little bit about the equipment I'm using. The amplifier I'm playing through today is a Mesa Boogie. It's one of their small 12-inch combos. The things I like about these amplifiers is it has a good, clean, articulate sound. The 5-band graphic EQ I found very useful for fine-tuning your sound at any particular gig. And it has a fairly good tone selection, which is important with reggae playing, depending on the instrument you're using. Next to the amplifier, I have a pedal board here, which is a Digitech unit, which I have a fair amount of customized sounds in. But the most important configuration in there is the fact that your pedal board should really have a gate, a compressor, reverb, fine if it has it. Most amplifiers come with it, so it's not that important. And some decent chorus sounds, which are used quite a lot these days in reggae. You may be wondering what kind of instrument I'm using. The finish I know looks a little bit unusual. It's actually a guitar made by Wayne Charvel, and the finish on this instrument is a shell finish. It's made from actual seashells. I find that it has a very hard, brittle kind of finish that adds to sustain on the guitar. And the guitar has a very nice, clean acoustic sort of sound, which transfers into electric sound as well. Now, when picking an instrument to use for reggae playing, it's important that the guitar is really able to produce a nice, strong, clean tone. I'm actually using Seymour Duncan pickups on this guitar, which work great for that purpose. I'd like to say something about the strings as well, because I'm a believer in using fairly heavy strings to produce a good, strong, clean sound. And it's very important that your strings aren't actually buzzing. I know many players try to get their action as low as possible, and this does have the effect of producing a watery sound if it starts to buzz and doesn't work too well with reggae playing. The pick I'm using is also a Jim Dunlop pick, which is one of these heavy jazz series picks. I find that the heavier the pick, the better the sound. So that's how I configure my playing. You can judge for yourself. Let's tune up before we start. What I'd like to do first is to cover some of the basic techniques involved in playing the two basic rhythms in reggae, which is, I'm going to call one the check, which is this, and the checker, which is a down-up stroke, which is this. Okay. Now, to control the sound, we're using two types of damping, left-hand damping and right-hand damping. Let's first of all look at the left-hand damping. Now, after you play the chord, what you're doing is that you're releasing the pressure on the strings to stop the sound. Look at that again. Play the chord, and then you're releasing the pressure. It sounds pretty straightforward, and it is. The right hand does a similar thing, but it's using the edge of the palm of the hand. And after you've struck the chord, as your pick is repositioning for the next stroke, the edge of the palm of the hand comes right down above the bridge. So it's a little more difficult on the right hand movement because it has to be fast. Watch. It's that. Now, what I'd like to do is to play through a rhythm and just use those techniques, and you'll just see how the basic sound is put together. Okay, the piece of music we just played there, if you notice, I did about 8 or 16 bars of the, depending how you're counting it, of the check and 8/16 of the checker. Now, there was something I was using there besides damping that's very important to reggae, and that is what I call percussiveness in your playing. You produce this with the left hand, and really what it is when you play a chord, instead of letting the chord ring, you reduce the pressure on the left hand, and you get that kind of sound. So instead of you having any ring in the chord when you play the check, it's more percussive. It's that kind of sound. Now, that's a very important component in reggae playing, and what you have to consider is most of the time you're playing along with a piano player who's playing the same figure in these basic rhythms, and the guitar has a way of cutting through on the top, so you have to try and get that playing, that style of playing consistent. What we want to do is look at the same rhythm again, which I'm going to play again, but I'm going to do variations of those two basic rhythms, the check and the checker, but played in different variations. After that last piece of music, I'd like to talk for a little about chord voicings. Now, in reggae music, what you have is pretty simple basic chords. You will use majors, minors, minor sevenths, major sevenths, the occasional diminished and augmented, an odd ninth every now and again. They're pretty simple chords that you're up against most of the time. The position that you play them on the neck is generally between the 3rd and the 12th fret. You try not to move out of that range. But when you're choosing your chord positions, you listen to what the piano player is doing in these basic rhythms we're covering. Because the piano player is normally playing exactly the same figure as you, and you need to listen to how he's voicing his chord. For example, he might be moving from a root position to a first inversion, so perhaps you would want to try a first inversion to a root position, or try the same inversion as him. It's a case of experimenting, but you need to use a voicing that complements his playing. Now, the voicing that the piano player normally uses is fairly close. He keeps his hands close together when he's playing the voicing. And what you try and do is you try and keep the guitar voicing also as close as possible. That means that if you were using, for example, a C major chord and a G major, you wouldn't play the C here and the G down there. You play the C here and the G here. You play it there. Now, in the progression that we just used, I use an A minor chord and a G. And I also played the G in this position. Now, if you look back at the music that we just played, you'll notice that I use both voicings, and if you listen to how that works against the piano, it should give you an idea of how the various voicings work. You might also notice that I, in fact, use an E minor 7th shape during one of the times when I was playing the chord, and that is because you never use more than the top 4 strings on the guitar when you're playing these voicings. It's very rarely that playing reggae you go outside of those top 4 strings. Downstrokes, it's always the top 4 strings. And upstrokes, you play the top 2 strings. Now, the time when you're using upstrokes is when you're playing a checker. And in that figure, the checker, the second part of the figure, is always softer than the first part. Now, that's one good reason to use the 2-string voicing. And that is pretty consistent. It doesn't change much from that. Now, the other thing that I want to discuss briefly before we just move on is something that I call dummy strokes. And this is used by the right hand. I don't know if you've noticed yet, but whenever I play, for every time I strike the strings with my right hand, I play a stroke in between where you don't hear anything. And what that does, it helps me keep time and helps me sort of fit into the groove, which is very important in reggae. What you really have is a lot of instrument parts that are locking together, and you have this interwoven sort of rhythmic structure that takes place, and the guitar and the keyboard, the check and the checker, sit on top of that. So anything that you can do that helps you keep in that rhythm is a good thing. This is a very common technique that's used by reggae guitarists. I'll just give you an example. When you're playing if you have a bar 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, you'll see that you're striking every beat of the bar. Look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4. You see that I'm playing every downbeat. Now, in the exercise we're going to be covering, you can look out for that and see how that works. It's a fairly important aspect of reggae. What we've just been covering is the basic rhythms. And there's two treatments of those rhythms which you commonly find in reggae. One is the straight 8 feel and one is the shuffle feel. The difference between those two feels is that the straight 8 is where you're using quavers in the bar, so everything is counted 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. In the shuffle feel you're using triplets and you're counting 1 and a, 2 and a, 3 and a, 4 and a. Now, those are the basic differences. The way you can identify very quickly if you're using a shuffle feel or if you're using a straight 8 feel is you can listen to the drummer's hi-hat or you can listen to the bass player. They're the most common players who will actually have to play the figures of the shuffle feel. Now I'm going to play one piece of music which I have two treatments for. The first one is going to be a straight 8, so let's look at that first. Now we're going to look at the shuffle feel, which is the same thing, but I have now a triplet figure on the hi-hat and in the bass. Otherwise, everything else is the same, but listen to the difference in feel and approach. Now I hope you can see that from those two different pieces of music there, that although it's the same piece of music, they have very different feels. One is fairly regimented and the other one is quite, you know, it's quite kind of laid back and has a nice flowing feel to it. Now, whenever you come up against a rhythm that you're going to play for, the first thing you have to identify is one of those two things, if it's a shuffle or a straight 8. Now, I'd like to move on to look at some of the more advanced techniques, but one thing I want to say is that it's very important when you're playing reggae. We're talking about some fairly fine nuances in the rhythm here. It's not really a question of playing right on the beat. In fact, it's a question of playing just behind the beat. And what you have to try and do is you have to try and hear the rhythm in your head before you try and put it in your hand. Very important. So every time you approach a piece of music or an exercise, I would say it's a good way of starting to just try and listen to it first and hear whether it's that shuffle feel, whether it's the straight 8 feel, whether it's a basic rhythm or one of the more one of the rhythm riffs which we're going to be looking at in the next segment of this tape. Now the next thing I'd like to look at is what I call rhythm riffs. Now so far we've been playing basic riffs, which is something that is played along with the piano. You both play exactly the same thing. In a rhythm riff, the guitar part is really playing a completely independent rhythm against the piano riff. It can be fairly simple or it can be fairly complicated. The different thing about playing rhythm riffs is that for the first time we use what I call a tenuto stroke. Now, everything up to this point has been a staccato, and what staccato means is that the duration of the note is very short. Tenuto means that you hold the duration of the note for its written length. So if it's a quaver, you're going to hold it for a full length of a quaver or an eighth note, whatever you call it. The best way for me to demonstrate it is perhaps to start playing them and then we'll talk about them. Now, I hope you can see from that that we're actually working against the rhythm of the piano. We have a counter rhythm that's working against the piano part and the bass part. And if you were to break that rhythm down, what you actually have is this development of staccato and tenuto notes. Now, in this particular rhythm, I was using 2 tenuto notes. If you just look at the rhythm with me playing it here, we had I don't know if you noticed there, but those 2 different strokes that I was talking about, the tenuto and the staccato, help to actually push the rhythm riff of the guitar part out. What you have is you have the bass line which is playing, and wherever there's a gap in the bass line, I use the tenuto sounds to push the guitar riff out. Now, if we have a look at the riff closely, what you have is on the first part, it's 2 staccato, and then 2 tenuto, and then a staccato at the end. That's what you have. Now, there are other ways you could play it. You could put those tenuto markings anywhere within that riff to give the rhythm riff a push in a different place. It would really depend on what the bass line is doing. And it's pretty variable. I mean, you could turn it around any which way you like. It's something that I would encourage you to experiment with when you're going through these riffs and looking and analysing them. You may well have some rhythms that you want to play these things against, and don't feel scared to experiment when using that tenuto and staccato marking wherever you feel it's appropriate. Now, I want to look at another example of a rhythm riff. This one in some ways is simpler, but it has a bigger push on the 3rd beat of the bar with the tenuto marking. Let's just look back and recap on some of the techniques that we've been using, and we've just incorporated all together in that exercise I've just played. We're using the damping sounds of the left hand, which controls and makes the sound staccato or tenuto. It makes it either or. Okay, we have that. So you have that pumping motion of the left hand. We also have the percussiveness that the left hand is controlling, and it's actually remember the application of the hand to the strings to get that kind of sound. You have the dummy strokes that are taking place as well on the rhythm of this hand. And there's one other thing I've been using in there, in the right hand damping, which might be hard for you to notice. That at the end of a figure, what I do is I put the right hand palm down on the strings to just make sure there's no extra sounds in there that shouldn't be there. What you'll find is that when you're recording reggae guitar tracks, that very often when you listen to the track on solo, you'll hear other noises taking place in between the actual, in the rhythm. And what we're trying to do is get rid of those as much as possible. Now, the gate on your pedal board helps, and you can normally, what I have a patch set up for these rhythm sounds so that the gate closes down as early as possible to get rid of any overtones or anything that might leak through. But the right hand is a way of ensuring that you're cutting off everything. If you just look at the rhythm, I'll just play it for you and show you where it comes down. We just played straight down to make sure there's no extra sounding of the strings. That's where the right hand damping went down. The 2 rhythm riffs that we've just covered are single bar riffs, and you will find that they're commonly used. You know, you can make them up in any combination of figures that you like. But another way that a rhythm riff is used, it's used in a 4-bar sequence. And what you can do is just take a straight check for the 4 bars, but fit a rhythm riff into the 3rd bar For example, that's the one I'm going to play. It can be quite effective. It's like having a fill that's constantly played every third bar, and this is another way of using a rhythm riff within an existing rhythm. Let me just play the example and you'll see. Now, as you could see from that, the tenuto note is here again used within the riff to push the figure out, and it's a very important part of playing those riffs. What you have to do is to become comfortable with the exchange that takes place with your left hand damping rather, between the tenuto and the staccato. What I would suggest is perhaps you could make up some exercises for yourself. It's hard for me to really give you a specific exercise because everybody is going to be on a different level. The only thing that I could say is that you should break down anything that you want to work on into its smallest units. So if it means, for instance, working on the right hand first, just deadening the strings and playing, doing that kind of thing, start there. When this hand feels comfortable, then bring in the left hand. If it's difficult to get the tenuto and the staccato, then work the rhythm riff, whatever it is, with just one or the other. Work it all tenuto and work it all staccato, and then kind of break up the two and try and put them together in different configurations. Work it without the rhythm, then work it with the rhythm. Make up new rhythms for yourself. But always try and break it down into its strongest components. Hear it in your head before you start playing, and then play it slowly on top of everything else. Now, going on with the rhythm riffs, another thing that I want to look at is that same 4-bar sequence, but using a completely different set of figures going right the way through. In other words, we're not going to use the check or the checker. We're going to base a figure around them that lasts for 4 bars. Now, I can't overstress when playing that kind of rhythm how important the dummy strokes are. Now, when you look at my hand playing, it mightn't look as if the dummy strokes are actually playing full strokes. In many cases, they're not. It's just a movement that I use to keep time in. But what happens is that I'm getting, from the stroke, the direction of where my hand should be for picking up the rhythm. For example, in that particular rhythm, the rhythm started on the and of the first beat. And without the dummy stroke, normally what you would tend to do is play it as a downstroke, where you play, which would be all wrong. So you play it with the dummy stroke first. It creates a very different sound, and it's something I can't overstress. If you look at that exercise, go through it, and check out how the dummy strokes work, and check out how you get that interaction between the up and the down strokes. If you try and play wherever, always starting with a downstroke, it's going to feel very uncomfortable. To complete this section on the rhythm riffs, I want to look at 2 more examples. And what I'm going to do is I want to take the last 2 bars of the last 4-bar rhythm riff that we played. And I want to show you how they can be used over a bass line and the difference it makes in the way that you place them. Now, as I've mentioned, the bass is a very important part in reggae. It actually holds the melody of the rhythm. And most musicians in a session, when you're perhaps playing and you're working with a singer will perhaps call the name of a song, and the bass player will normally say, how does the bass line go? And you'll hum the bass line, and that's what everybody remembers the song from. Now, the spaces that the bass line leaves is the place that you fill with the rhythm riffs. I just want to demonstrate in these two rhythms how if you put it in the wrong place, how it can have a kind of negative effect. The last two bars I'm taking of the previous 4-bar exercise. What I'm going to do now is play exactly the same piece of music, but what I've done is I've taken the bass line figure and I've turned it around so you have the space in a different place in the bar. Now, listen to how the guitar part, which is the same guitar part, now interacts with that bass part. Now, what I'm going to do in this piece, I'm going to play this exactly the same piece of music we just did with a new bass line, but I'm now going to play the rhythm riff that we were working on. I'm going to change that around, and you can see how all of a sudden everything starts to lock in. If you were listening to that last piece, if you notice all the spaces in the guitar track, in the bass track, they all come in the same place. And then when the bass is busy and playing, the guitar track is also busy and playing. And that's something you always try and avoid in reggae. You listen to where the instruments are playing and you try and leave space for them, and everybody tries and works around each other. I leave space wherever possible. Listen to the difference now when I change the guitar track. Now, if you listen to that, I don't know if you noticed how everything just started to lock in together. Whereas the bass playing stops, the guitar picks it up. And that is really a very important thing about reggae, as I've been stressing all through this tape. It's very important that all these parts interlock and work together. Now, the bass that you're hearing, I have actually toned, when I've mixed it, an octave higher than how it would sound in a real live situation. So in terms of a bass player, if you're working with a bass player, don't expect the bass to sound this high. It's actually toned quite high so that it will come through over your TV speaker. But in real life, the bass actually is toned much lower in frequency range, and so it doesn't cut through so well. It's something that you have to, as a player, start listening to, and when you listen to records, listen out for that, listen how all the different parts interweave and how they work around each other. The next thing I'd like to talk about are rhythm fills. Now, I want to go back to the basic rhythms that we started on, because this is where you really use rhythm fills. And a rhythm fill is basically when you have a simple rhythm, like a check or a checker rhythm. You're playing down with the music. There are times throughout the piece where you want to put something in to accentuate perhaps a change from a verse to a chorus, or perhaps it's just you've got to a 16-bar point in the music and you feel something needs to go in there. Now, the piano, which, remembering the basic rhythms, is playing the same figure as you. The piano player also plays rhythm fills, which are very similar to yours. So the first thing is that when you're playing in a live situation, you need to have some kind of eye contact organized or whatever with the piano player, that you don't play the rhythm fills at the same time. It's always a case that one of you take the rhythm fill, the other one keeps playing the straight bang or the straight checker, whatever you want to call it. Now, the right hand plays most of the damping in the rhythm fills. And what I'm going to do is just talk through them first, and then we'll play through them. And hopefully you'll understand them best from that method. Now, the chords that you use in the rhythm fills are the same chords that you're playing for the rhythm itself. It's the same majors and minors. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through the most common ones that you find. For example, you have an A minor chord here, and what you do for the rhythm fill is you put a ninth on the top of the chord. You play that. So you'd get that. If it's a minor seventh in this shape, or it could even be a G chord, but you just use the E minor seventh shape for it, you play the seventh on the top, the D. If it's a major chord, let's say it's an A major, you'd use the ninth as well. You play it like that. If it's a major seventh, let's say in the position of C here, you would use the D as well. Now, those are the chords and those are the notes that you use on top. What I'm going to do now is kind of go through the rhythms and how you actually use them and build them up, employing the staccato, the tenuto, and the right hand damping, which I said is very important in these. Now, for example, the most basic one is this one. That's the most basic one. Now, here again, what you're using is the tenuto stroke and using the staccato to actually get a push in the rhythm. What I'm now going to do is play the same thing, and what I've done is I've extended the notes. You have the same basic figure, but I've extended the notes. If you look at the notation that accompanies this, you can see it quite clearly written out. It has an extra note written in there. And the last one, which has an additional note written, again, is... Okay? There's most probably more than one extra note in there. Now, what I'm going to do is play a rhythm and use those chords, those chord fills, those rhythm fills, going against the rhythm so you can get a feel of how they will be used. I'll just mix them up into any combination. What you can do is then kind of break them down and look at them and analyze them as you feel comfortable. Now, in that exercise we just went through, I am actually using the fill much more than you would normally. As I said earlier, you use it to accentuate going into a verse from a chorus or a chorus from a verse. Or it might be where you feel it in a 16 or 32 bar section. You certainly don't use it on every other bar like I was using. I was just trying to demonstrate how it is used. One of the interesting things, you might have seen that I was playing two inversions of the G major chord. I was playing it in the third position here and in the seventh position. In the seventh position, when I used the fill, I was dropping off the bass note G because I'm not playing that note. I'm not playing the G in the bass. Remember, it's only the top four strings that I'm using. And so I was in fact playing a E minor chord. And that is quite acceptable. You can be playing an E minor over a G. It's allowable, so don't even worry about that. Now, another kind of fill that you commonly find is what I call a slide fill. This is a fill that was really used in the rock steady era just before reggae, but is actually used in reggae on quite a regular basis. You'll find any reggae guitarist has this as part of his ammunition. And what it is that between two chords, let's say for instance we have the same G to A minor, when you play the chord, that will be in the one bar. Before you go to the next bar, you go to a semitone below, and you slide up into the chord. Now, the easiest way for me to show you is to play it with a piece of music. So I'm going to play back that same piece of music, and I'll just use that slide fill. You can see how it's used. Now, that's the slide fill as you would normally use it. Here again, I'm overusing it so you can get a lot of it in a short space of time to get a feel for how it's used. But usually it's only used every 4, 8 or 16 bars. It just depends. What I'd like to talk about now is picking guitar. Now, as I said earlier, the bass line in reggae, and in the rhythm section we're talking, plays the melody. And very often what you find is, for example, if you have 2 guitar players, that one guitarist plays rhythm and the other guitarist plays picking guitar, where he picks the same line as the bass player. Now, as I also mentioned earlier, the bass is normally toned very low, so the effect this has is that it gives a top part to the bass line, which lets the line carry through so that it can be easily heard. Now, that's one way that you can use picking guitar. Another way is that you can actually play independent riffs that sort of work around the rhythm. The sound that you use for both of them, because they're actually very similar in technique, is that you dampen the strings with the right hand here, with the edge of the palm, and you play the note. That's the kind of sound. Now, for this patch, what I normally have on my pedal board is an independent picking patch, where the mid frequencies are boosted a little bit, and I've reduced the reverb to just punch out the sound. Now, when you're playing a bass line, which is the first thing I'm going to cover, what you do is look at where on the fingerboard the bass player is actually playing, and you try and follow his finger positions. Don't play above the G string. Keep everything on the lower 4 strings, and try and keep the sound consistently dampened. You don't want the sound ringing through. And that same technique would apply if you're actually playing a riff. Now, the other thing that you find is that very often you'll be asked to play what is called a rattle, which is wherever you get a gap in the bass line. For instance, if this is the bass line, if that's the bass line, the rattle would be that's what you would do. Now, it's not something that's used all the time, but it's something that you can throw in every now and again to just give the line flavor. Now, I'm going to play a rhythm, and I'm first of all going to play a bass line. I'm going to play along with the bass, and then I'm going to throw in that rattle every now and again. And then I'm going to go and play I'm just going to find a picking riff. Now, one thing I'd just like to add about that technique is that when you're playing, most of the times I try and use downstrokes because you get a stronger sound. You need to actually pluck the strings fairly hard. So I try and put as many downstrokes into that as possible. What I would suggest you do is to just give yourself some exercises where you use this damping technique and try and get comfortable. Perhaps try scales, whatever you feel. You know, everybody's on a different level, so you just need to break your playing down and start at the lowest point and work up. But try and get comfortable with that, because it is a very important part of reggae playing. And don't be scared here again to invent things for yourself and move it around and throw it around and be inventive. That's what it's all about. In this section of the video, I'd like to touch on some of the more contemporary techniques that are being used in reggae. One of the important things that have happened in the last few years is that the bass and drums have really held the reggae sound, but what has happened to the guitar and the keyboard is that they've been freed up from playing the bang or the checker and the check. And what has really taken place is that typical reggae sound that you get from those instruments has been picked up by usually a percussion instrument. It could be a finger snap or a hand clap or whatever. And what normally happens in a lot of the contemporary reggae pieces is that the keyboard player, the piano player, now plays something that is much closer to R&B chord voicings. Now what happens to the guitar part? You really have a choice. A lot of the time the usual thing is that you play sort of picking fills going through. But one thing that I use quite effectively, it always sounds quite nice and textural, is to use broken chords over a rhythm. And a good way of doing this is for instance, if you have, let's say you have a progression that's A minor, F and G, normally they'd be played in this position. The technique that I use for playing these broken chords is I use a picking technique very similar to what country players use, where I use an alternate bass with a pick, where I play 2 bottom strings, and then I put alternate notes in between with my middle finger and ring finger. So you get that. Now, the one problem with that is that in the open string positions, the chords tend to sound a little bland and overused. So what I try and do is find different voicings for them, and if possible, try and find some pedal notes that the 3 chords that we're talking about here, the A minor, the F, and the G, can share. And in this case, I normally choose something like an open E. You can use the open B string as well. So what I would do is I'd put the A minor into this voice in here. You see it has a little more texture to it. The F, which is an F major 7th, and then just leave the G with the E on top as well. That's one way of voicing it. You can also play the F here and the G there. So I'm pedaling there with the E, and I've also pedaled with the D in the bass. But what you get is a bigger textural sound to the guitar. So what you'd have there is okay. Now, what I'd like to do is to play that in a piece of music. But what I'm also going to do is do some double stopping, which is another effect that fits in with this kind of playing. It's also a technique that a lot of non-reggae artists use when they play reggae music. Instead of playing the full chord, they'll double stop, use a dampened sound with the right hand, and just pick 2 notes out of the chord. Normally it's the root and the 3rd. So we have an A minor here, so we have the A and the C natural, and you just go down to a note below. I'm using the B, or you might go up to the D, and then use the F position here, or the F and the A, and the G and the B. And here again, like I've been saying all along, what you can do is experiment with the kind of notes, your choice of notes, and how you put them together to get these voicings. It's very much an experiment. When I'm working in the studio and I'm asked to do this kind of work, I don't start off at any preconceived points. What I'll do is I think about the chords, I think about the key, I might tune the guitar a different way. Sometimes I use a system, I use 2 guitars. I might use what I call a high-strung guitar, which they use again in country music a lot, where they have basically the top 3 strings are duplicated on the bottom. It's really strong, like imagine a 12 string. You've taken the one set of strings off a 12 string and put it on another guitar, and then I'll play the 2 things in different positions to get a bigger textural sound. Use anything within your armament to try and get the sound that you want, and don't be scared to experiment. I'm going to play this piece of music and just have a listen to these 2 things being used. interesting things about that piece is that the chords that are being played is the F to G to A minor to G to F, and starts again. But the bass is playing from the F to the G to the A minor, and it goes down to the E. And what I play over that E chord, E minor chord, although the chords are playing a G chord over the E bass, I actually play the harmonics here. And I'm just raising that tone there to from what is a G note to an A note, which has a nice little color to it. Also on the G chord, I'm playing on the F chord. It's like a suspended 4 position you play here in on the D chord. And when I get to the A minor chord, I'm playing 2 harmonics there on the B string and the E string, which just add a little light color, and it just helps that whole kind of textural feel. The double stopping, as you saw, was pretty straightforward and simple. And here again, it works in between the rhythm. What you have to do is to listen to where the bass is playing, and in this case of this rhythm, the kick drum is quite busy, so you have to really listen to those things and just fit it in between. In closing, there's a couple of things I'd like to say. The first thing is that you should really try and play with as much live musicians as possible in a live music situation. You can't substitute the feel of 3 other musicians playing along with you with a tape or a rhythm box or anything else, especially in a music like reggae, where so much depends on the interaction between the individual musicians. I would also recommend that you don't be afraid to vary and stray from what the norm is, and make up your own things and try and find your own sound in the own route you want to follow, and try and work with musicians who are open to listening and trying new things. One thing that you should remember though in reggae playing is that very often the rule is that less says more. So when it comes to performance, try not to overcrowd pieces. It's very often the case that musicians will get into a situation where they're just holding a nice groove and a nice riff, but will tend to drift from that and get involved in playing other things. Be satisfied with getting a great groove together and just work with that. Playing less is very often saying more.